Hello, Comparative Politics class. Dr. Maiden here, bringing you a video for CPO 4.3, that is Globalization and Political Economy. Okay, so let's start with, if you're looking at the slides, or I'll pop a couple of pictures up here. Let's start with where in the world. Take a second, look at these pictures. Where in the world are we talking about today? Thinking about the subject, globalization and political economy. This one's probably pretty obvious compared to some of these others that I've given you that are really obscure African countries or South American countries, right? This is Brexit. This is very much about Brexit. Brexit has been a huge issue. We're talking the United Kingdom leaving the EU. If we're talking about the impact of globalization and what it can do to the political economy of states, but then this idea of a global political economy. Think of the ramifications of something like Brexit. The UK, one of the strongest economies in the world with one of the strongest currencies, the pound sterling, first getting involved in the EU, but in a very limited capacity, right? They never really fully committed to the EU. And the book goes into a lot of reasons why for that in this particular chapter reading that we're doing. But now with this decision to leave Brexit, or to leave the EU altogether with this Brexit, right? Voting, having a referendum vote, a very slim margin of victory, and now the UK has officially, as of January 31st, left the European Union. And it's pretty fascinating. We're going to go through a couple of things here where we're going to talk about globalization, we're going to talk about different types of market economies, and what this could potentially mean for the UK, that they have now left the European Union altogether. Overwhelmingly, the broad consensus is that this is going to hurt the economy. This is going to hurt the British economy. The per capita income is going to suffer because of this. And there's a lot we could go into. My gosh, you could probably teach a whole class that's just about Brexit. But hopefully as we move through this lecture, we're going to see how different aspects of globalization, political economy, impact that states are having, responses states are having. Hopefully we can see how Brexit can kind of take shape through this lecture. All right, so we're going to dive in here right after a brief musical interlude. Okay, so if you're following along with the slides, we're starting with globalization, defining globalization. There's lots of different ways that you can define globalization. In this case, the book talks about a rapid increase in the flow of economic activity, technology, communication, the increase in sharing of cultural symbols, political ideas, movement across countries, right? In another textbook I use, they say simply the deepening and widening of worldwide interconnectedness. So this term globalization really came to prominence as an idea, as a model for political economy in the 1990s. So the book outlines the three key questions that we can be asking about globalization and its impact on political economy. So the first one is this idea of, does it really represent this kind of brave new world where the fundamental relationship between states and the market has changed forever? Is that really true? Can we say that? Is globalization big enough to carry that weight? That states and the markets and their relationships have fundamentally changed forever? Or is it just kind of the latest phase in a relationship between markets and the states? And possibly something else will come after this phase of globalization. The second question we can ask is just, what caused this in the first place? I already hinted at a couple of things, but we're going to go into more detail here. And the third would just be, what can or should be done about it, if anything? Should there be some kind of response to globalization, that we should be addressing it in some way, whether as states, whether as the international community? Okay, so we're going to walk through and explore answers to each of these questions throughout this lecture. So let's start with this idea of the brave new world, globalization in the brave new world. So we've got this quote from Omai, who's a Japanese economist. It's the idea that globalization represents, quote, the end of the state. The end of the state. And I'd love to know your thoughts if you want to comment down below here. What might we mean here? Globalization represents the end of the state as we know it. Okay. Omai had a couple of ideas here. He was saying things like the rapid flow of money, of goods and services, of ideas, of cultural symbols, it will necessarily weaken national identity, right? People are stopping seeing them so much as maybe a US citizen, and they're seeing themselves more as a world citizen. When you have such ease of access to transfer money, to transfer positions, to move around the world for jobs, you have a decreased need for the state, one could argue. Oh, I should say, I'm sorry. With several of these videos I might do today, there is construction right down the hall in the bathroom. And so you might hear hammering or chiseling, or right now the sound of some type of very strong power drill. I'm sorry. I have to keep going. Got to keep getting these videos done. Okay. So we're talking about globalization and the end of the state. Weak national identity, decreasing a need for the state. Businesses can move more freely. We're going to talk about that both kind of as a positive and as a negative of globalization. Businesses can move all around the world. If they don't like the business practices in one state, they can move to a different state and try their luck there. Okay. The last thing that we could say then maybe is strengthening IOs, strengthening international organizations like the UN, like the European Union, like the African Union, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And also you see a really strong increase in global civil society. So there's a lot of NGOs that are taking care of things for people. There are nonprofits that are taking care of people, almost in a lot of cases better than the state was able to. So the state is being eclipsed by the power of something like Doctors Without Borders to go in and provide medical assistance in a time of emergency, as opposed to doctors within a country's own state being able to do that at the same capacity. So one big argument here with globalization and the idea of the death of the state is going to be that regional, if not global management is going to have to fill the role. So we're going to have to be turning to more organizations like the EU as opposed to Greece or Poland to manage the affairs of states. Okay? I'd be curious to know, do you agree? Do you agree with this, that globalization represents in some sense the death of the state? Comment down below if you have something interesting to say about this, or an example of possibly a state where you could say, I think that state has pretty much already died. The regional community, the global community has already taken over management of that state. Okay? So let's take it back here for a minute and talk about causes of globalization. A huge defining issue, moment for the international community was the fall of the Soviet Union. And the fall of the Soviet Union created a space in which these things that I'm about to talk about were able to really come into prominence. So the book outlines two big things that were driving forces other than just this fundamental reshaping of politics post-Cold War. Two big driving forces. The first one being technology. I mean, the fact that we are able to be in the middle of a coronavirus outbreak and we can shut down face-to-face classes, and I know that you guys all have smartphones in your pockets, laptops, iPads, personal computers. You can go to YouTube, right? I mean, just the fact that YouTube is a thing, that we can do this via YouTube. And here we are. You've got data on your phone, you've got free internet access, you've got internet that you're paying for in your house, high speed. I can do SD quality videos, and we can still have class. That is the power of technology, internet communication. The fact that it's on YouTube, I could share this with my friends in Malawi. They could take this college class with you at the exact same time that you're taking it, because there is worldwide interconnectedness now through technology. Travel is easier, advances are easier, it's easier than ever to ship things. My gosh, Amazon Prime. I just had to order a new set of sheets. It came in less than 24 hours, right? The second thing that we can talk about here, the second thing, neoliberal economic policies. And this is, again, very much a response to fall of the Soviet Union, fundamental shifting in world order, not only international political world order, but economic world order. The US and its partners came together in the early 1990s and created a wide agenda of neoliberal economic policies. They instated them across a host of, not only within their own states, across a host of international organizations, pursuing this agenda of neoliberal economic policies: capitalism, development, democracy, hands-off, laissez-faire economics, right? The market should be allowed to adjust itself. States should not interfere. So things that happened: the World Trade Organization lowered tariffs worldwide on imports and exports, made it easier for goods and services to move from country to country, removed government control of things like the exchange rate, just getting government out of the market in general. That was huge for allowing countries to fundamentally shift the way they were doing their economic policies before, during the Cold War era. Okay, so we have technology and we have neoliberal economic policies that really were a driving force here for the speed at which globalization took root around the world. So let's talk for a minute then about responses. How should we respond, or how have states responded, political responses to globalization? There's a couple of things we could talk about here. Obviously, there have been issues related to trade. Trade and immigration have been the two foundational challenges or issues that have emerged out of globalization that states have had to handle. So things with trade, the idea of like wages. We have to pay fair wages. And now there's a sense to which fair wages is fair wages, whether it's India or Peru or the US. So even if the US wants to be outsourcing work to another country, there's still challenges of, we have to be thinking about working conditions. We have to think about wages. We have to think about keeping our goods and services competitive to now a global market. So you could have something like artisan craft makers in Peru, where they're only able to make, let's say it's furniture, they're only able to make 4 chairs a week. Compare that to something like some factory in China where they're pumping out 4 chairs every 20 minutes. How does an artisan craft maker compete in that kind of market? It doesn't, right? It can't upscale at the same rate that some Chinese company could with something like chairs. All right, so it becomes a big challenge of, what are wages going to be? What are working conditions going to be? How do we compete in this now globalized market? And it leads to things like immigration. If I can't compete where I am, I will move elsewhere. So if Japan and South Korea are able to make cars on the cheap, the US has to adjust its model. The US cannot make cars in the same way that it was making cars if it cannot compete with South Korean and Japanese models. And we saw this. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. Another issue is political responses that have come to the forefront with globalization is this idea of the challenge or the tragedy of the commons. And this is the idea that the global community is having to deal with shared problems. In the tragedy of the commons, what happens is that individuals, we can say here individual states act in their own self-interest, and they make decisions, they take actions that are not in the best interest of the global common. So here we can think of issues like environmental issues. So countries like China, the US, the UK, pumping air pollution out into the world at the expense of countries that are not having these air pollution. They're not creating the same level of air pollution, but it's a shared problem. Countries like Japan engaging in overfishing, countries like Brazil burning the Amazon, challenges of deforestation, open burning. This was a big challenge everywhere that I've ever lived and been in sub-Saharan Africa. Open burning that just really leads to poor air quality. It's a tragedy of the commons of, I'm making decisions that are in my best interest as someone who owns a logging company, It's not in the best interest of the indigenous people living in Brazil. It's maybe not in the best interest of the global community, the fact that a lot of our oxygen purification comes from the Amazon. So if you take down all the trees and turn it into livestock farming, I care about that living in Florida, even if the livestock farmers in Brazil are thinking about it in a very different way. Okay? So the last thing that we can say here, political responses, before we get into state responses, political responses in the sense that there has been a rise in global civil society. So even take any of the issues that I mentioned, overfishing, deforestation, challenges of global crime. That was the one I missed when I'm looking at the slide. Challenges of global crime, terrorism, piracy, organized crime, drug trafficking, all of these issues that have become globalized, because just like we are able to do something like communicate even during a coronavirus outbreak via YouTube, it has fundamentally changed the way in which terrorist organizations are able to operate. Terrorists are active on Twitter, they're active on Facebook, they're recruiting, they're posting YouTube videos, they're using the same internet space that we are. Organized crime groups, drug trafficking groups, okay? So it's the challenge of we have this shared space, this shared common space, that we have serious issues that we need to be addressing. And global civil society has risen to kind of meet that challenge in a lot of different ways, often going back to the point from Omai, eclipsing the state, surpassing the state, making the state irrelevant. Okay? So we're going to take a quick pause here, stop the video, stretch your legs. We're going to come back here and we're going to talk very briefly about some state responses to globalization. Okay, so let's take just a couple more minutes here and focus and drill down on how states in particular have responded to the challenges of globalization. I've got this slide up here and I want to talk about, I already mentioned when I was talking about the auto industry. One of the big challenges for states has been this issue of deindustrialization. That has been a very big challenge, in particular for wealthy countries. And on the slide you'll see I've walked it down here, and we're gonna talk about it quickly. So, as a result of globalization, global transportation and communication have improved astronomically. So, industries like the auto industry and the steel industry in the US could afford to move to countries with lower production costs. They can pay lower wages, they can have poorer working conditions for the people in the country, and they don't care, right? They don't have the same protection, not that they don't care, that's totally wrong to say. They don't have the same protections in a state like Mexico, in a state like, Bangladesh or wherever. There's not the same protections in place. So they can pay lower wages, they can have poorer working conditions, and lower their production costs. So, goods now are manufactured cheaper in the developing world, and they're exported back into the US. So, as a result, in the case of things like the auto industry, hundreds of thousands of Americans lost their jobs in industrial positions. Deindustrialization, hundreds of thousands. And that's still happening within the auto industry, within the steel industry. Even think of something like the coal industry as people are transitioning to cleaner forms of energy. In my home state of Kentucky, this is an issue every election cycle. The fact that they're trying to shut down mining operations or transition out of mines to some other type of energy, even for the state of Kentucky. Okay? So that's a big challenge, deindustrialization, and the fact that it put hundreds of thousands of people out of work all over the developed world as these jobs shifted to the developing world. So the challenge here in terms of state responses, there's two expectations of how developed states in particular should respond to this threat of deindustrialization. And I'm going to walk through two quickly here in the last minute or so, because I don't want these to get too long, these videos. So the first idea, there's two schools of thought here. The first idea is simply called convergence. And it's this idea that globalization will force the same type of neoliberal policies across all countries. So it'll arrive slower in Mexico or in Brazil or in Sudan than it has in the US. But there will reach a point, we will converge to this point where all around the world we're sharing in the same neoliberal policies. And so you won't be able to get away with things like lower wages and poorer working conditions. It'll level out. Okay? That's one theory. The other theory here is rooted in what we call the varieties of capitalism school. And what it's trying to do here is provide a little bit more of a nuanced look at this to say, okay, there is such a thing as comparative institutional advantage. I'm laughing because I kind of look like a bunny rabbit with the way my hands are. I'm sorry. Oh, this is a crazy time, y'all. Dr. Bunny. All right. Comparative institutional advantage. So what we're arguing here, we talked about with T.A. Trueheart, we talked about different kinds of capitalist systems. And so different systems have different institutional advantages. And so because of their different institutional advantages, they will take different approaches to handling deindustrialization. So I'll pop up the slide here and we can talk very quickly about the differences here when we compare coordinated market economies, the CMEs that we talked about in the previous lecture, and liberal market economies, LMEs. So for coordinated market economies, we're looking at firms are much more coordinated with each other. They're much more independent, interdependent with each other and with governments. Labor laws are not as flexible. Firms and banks hold stock in each other's companies. It's not easy to move people around. There's much stronger unionization. When people get jobs, they keep those jobs. So a challenge for countries like Germany, like Japan, as they're addressing deindustrialization, they have to be thinking more in terms of long-range planning. They have to be thinking more in terms of how we level this out over a longer time horizon. Okay? Comparing that to something like liberal market economies, limited coordination with the government, more flexible labor laws, limited incentive to train employees. It's easy to just fire and move on. It's much easier to just say, you know what, we're moving to Mexico. You all are done. I'll hire some Mexicans. Okay? Rates of unionization are very low in LME economies, the US, the UK. So a big focus here is a lot more about short-term goals, profit goals, in particular trying to enhance stock market prices. We've seen this even with the coronavirus stuff that's happening right now. So much emphasis on what is the stock market doing? That's because we're an LME. We're a liberal market economy. And we care about that. We care about short term. We care about short fixes. We care about stock prices, okay? Because it's a fundamental change in the way our economies function, the way our economies relate to the government. And so our approaches are going to be different. Even within both these models, whether it's the LME model or the CME model, there is still an expectation that there's going to be convergence here as well. But the point of the varieties of capitalism argument is to say, but they're on different trajectories, and that's important. So it's not so easy to just say, oh, there'll be convergence, we'll just deal with it, right? It's much more of a sense of, okay, there might be convergence, but we're on very different goals and missions, and we're running different races, okay? So I'm going to stop there because I don't want this to get too long. Don't forget, go to Canvas, take the quiz, and let me know if you have any questions or comments. You can put them down below in the comment box here. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you like this for the next lecture. All right, have a great day.